Hey guys, Chris here with the Good Old Gamer. So today we're going to talk about games of 2017 and what the hell actually happened. 2017, in my opinion, is a turning point year. There's been a lot of things going on, from loot crates and loot boxes. This has been big, especially over the holiday season, especially with Star Wars Battlefront 2, Call of Duty World War 2, Destiny 2, a lot of twos in there, and various other games. And all the way back earlier on into the year, we saw the death of one of gaming's most treasured franchises in Mass Effect Andromeda. So what in the hell is actually going on? I'm going to go ahead and kind of throw out my opinion as to what may be the cause of these issues, why I think gaming's going to be in flux for a while, especially the big AAA developers. They're going to need to rethink their marketing strategy and the way that they're approaching gaming, and where I think things will eventually fix themselves because the market will basically force them to, whether they want to do it or not. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the hell is actually going on. AAA developers focusing on the wrong market. Multiplayer. Back in the day, multiplayer was just something that was added onto a game to extend the longevity. For example, we're going to use GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. So multiplayer on the N64 game GoldenEye was extremely fun. Anybody that was playing video games back in the day, anybody that was around back then, has very fond memories of this, sitting around with a bunch of their friends and blowing the hell out of each other and everybody fighting over whoever was going to be Oddjob. Even though the multiplayer was really great and everybody had a fun experience with it, most of the unlocks, I actually believe all of the unlocks for multiplayer, were actually a part of the single-player campaign. And the reason for this is the single-player campaign was the meat and potatoes of the game. The multiplayer was just reused assets from the game, just redeveloped into a smaller map, and then you just run around and shoot each other, and it was a lot of fun. Now, this same mechanic, or these same mechanics, have been used in gaming pretty much since then. This is just the way that the game can outlast the single-player campaign, which may be anywhere from 10 to 50 hours, but you're typically not going to get a single-player experience much longer than that. So this is just to add extra value to the game. This is where multiplayer originally started. Now today, multiplayer in games is the main attraction of the game. Think of something like Call of Duty. Most people play those games for multiplayer only. Now, the issue with multiplayer-only games are because that they're very much gameplay based. Now, that's something I'm going to go into here in a little bit, the difference between story-based games and gameplay-based games. But they're gameplay-based games, which means that they have to change up the formula on you. Otherwise, you're basically just playing the same exact thing over and over and over again. This is the reason why people are getting a little bit upset with Call of Duty, because they keep changing things a little bit and people don't like that. But then when they revert back, then it seems bland because it's basically the same thing that you played years ago when they didn't have wall jumping and double jumps and all this other stuff. And that's leading people into feeling the stagnation of basically doing the exact same thing over and over again with a different paint job. Different graphics, slightly different looking maps, maybe some different weapons, but you're doing the exact same thing over and over again, and every year you're paying another $60. Now, what's really pushing people over the edge has been the introduction of microtransactions. Now, microtransactions are a system where the developers are trying to extract more money and also inject greater longevity into these multiplayer games. Now, adding microtransactions doesn't really work so well into single-player games. It's basically just called DLC because they actually have to create new content for you to play. Whereas in a multiplayer game, they can just do costumes or weapon skins or extremely basic things that don't really take a whole lot of time for developers to actually create. You don't have to play test the skin. All it is a different texture. So this is a very cheap and easy way for them to extract more money out of the game. And for those people that really, really love the game and they're just looking for something else to do inside of the game, basically the next thing to achieve after they've unlocked all kinds of weapons and things, that is just another thing for them to do. So it does add that extra level of longevity. The problem is now, instead of just playing the game and getting random rewards or possibly getting specific rewards at certain levels, it has now been randomized and you are encouraged to use real-world money to basically buy these things. And much of the user base have actually gone ahead and calculated what it would take if you wanted to collect all of the items in a specific game. And typically in most of these games that just released at the end of 2017, such as Star Wars Battlefront, Call of Duty World War II, Destiny 2, so on and so forth, we're looking at thousands and thousands of dollars if you actually wanted to acquire everything inside of the game. Now, most people aren't going to be going after every piece of content that is in there. They basically just want a few pieces, but these games don't allow you to just get what it is that you want. For example, if you want a specific skin, in reality, you should be able to buy it for $2 or $3. But what they're doing is they're incentivizing you to spend even more money because you have to get it in a random loot box. Now, this has really been pissing off the community, but it's just a small microcosm of the greater issue that AAA developers are not developing games that are substantial. There's not enough substance there, and they're trying to fill in the lack of substance with microtransactions and loot boxes and just randomness, basically RNG. Replace substance with RNG. That is the new formula. And the community is not thrilled with this particular proposition. There are two aspects that define a game: story and gameplay. Multiplayer-based games are gameplay-only experiences. This means that it's just you with some items in a world, and you're given some sort of rules. Maybe you have to take a point, maybe you have to kill X amount of people, whatever it happens to be, and then that's it. And then you go and you continue on. There's nothing there to keep you playing this except for some sort of fake false progression, because you're literally just doing the same thing over and over again. The reason why people do play these games, such as like CSGO, for example, is because they enjoy it. The gameplay experience is fun, it's challenging, and it's rewarding in and of its own right. So it doesn't need anything else to stand on its own legs. But this is the reason why microtransactions have come into play, is because some people need that little bit extra to grind for or to work towards. There always needs to be something else to do in a multiplayer-only experience, because there's literally nothing else there besides the gameplay. And changing gameplay can actually have negative consequences. As I mentioned before, in the Call of Duty series, a lot of people didn't like the whole futuristic way things went. Call of Duty tries to take itself a little too seriously and needs to make things make sense, meaning like you can't do wall jumping back in World War II, which I don't see why you can't do that, but they want to go ahead and make it more or semi-realistic, I suppose. So they didn't want to do that, so they took things into the future. Some people liked it and some people didn't. Basically, you're changing the core formula that a lot of people liked, and some people will like this better and some people don't. So it's not always a good thing to change the gameplay experience, but in reality, it's a necessity, because otherwise you're literally just doing the exact same thing over and over again. Now, single-player games can either be story-driven, or they can be gameplay-based, or they can be a combination of the two. In a single-player game, you have far more options as a developer. You can focus on maybe a minor story that's somewhat interesting with really, really good gameplay. Think of something like Doom. Doom doesn't really have a great story. Your job is just to kill all the demons and send them back to hell. It's good enough reason for me, and the gameplay is what keeps me playing the game because it's a lot of fun. Now, then you have a game like Mass Effect, not Andromeda, but like the original Mass Effect series, where the gameplay, especially Mass Effect 1, wasn't that much fun. A lot of people didn't really care for Mass Effect 1's gameplay. I felt it was perfectly fine, but the story is what made that game excellent. The fact that there were literally hold your breath, holy shit moments in that game that would rival anything in any TV series or movie series that have ever been created. It is seriously one of the most enveloping story arcs that has ever been made. Now, granted, it didn't end very well, and that's another topic for another video, but that doesn't take away from Mass Effect as a whole series, and what it was able to do. And there are many games in this particular category. I just use Mass Effect, for example. You can look at another BioWare game, such as Knights of the Old Republic. Fantastic game. Story-based game. Skyrim. Fantastic game. Story-based game. More exploration. So that could kind of go 50-50. And that's kind of where I'm going here. With a story-based game or a single-player game, you have much more options, much more variety. Mega Man, definitely more of a gameplay type game. There's not a whole lot of story there. You just run around, and the game is fun because of the gameplay mechanics, the level design, things of that nature. So in that context, there's a lot more flexibility for developers to develop their game. Now, why is it important to go ahead and actually differentiate between story-based and gameplay-based games? The reason for this is the indie developers and small developers out there. Because of the limited resources of indie developers and small developers, they can't afford big budget scripts, they can't afford big budget actors, they can't afford big budget facial animation, they can't make games like Uncharted 4. They simply can't do it. They don't have the resources. But a game like, I don't know, let's say PUBG, the most popular and biggest game of 2017, did not require millions upon millions of dollars. This was developed by a small studio where they had an idea for a game type that just simply didn't exist yet. Now, the game is riddled with bugs. It's not coded very well. The netcode's kind of shoddy. The port to the Xbox hasn't been very good. But you have to understand that the original game was not built by Bungie with $500 million. This was built by a small group of people who simply had an idea for a game type, a gameplay experience that simply wasn't accessible to the masses. Sure, there were a couple games out there that were kind of similar, but nobody really did it in the way that PUBG has, where it's very accessible, it's easy to get into, the rules are easy to understand, and pretty much anybody can pick it up, play a few matches, and kind of understand exactly what it is that they're doing, and those people that really want to invest a lot of time into the game can get really good at it. Personally, I don't much care for the game and the gameplay style, but I understand its appeal. It's very primitive. Comes down to, the basic survival instincts in our mind. You're dropped into an area. It's like Lord of the Flies, This is where you are, everybody's out to get you, and last man standing wins. Now, gameplay experiences like this are not super hard to develop. You need just basic resources. You need to build a map, which in their case was actually very big and expansive, so that's a little bit different, but you think of Call of Duty. If you wanted to build a Call of Duty clone, it's not terribly hard. The map size is relatively small. Graphics don't need to be that great. You just need some basic animation, maybe some basic voice acting, and then you just need gameplay mechanics, and that's about it. The game's good to go. Now think of that versus developing something like, Knights of the Old Republic, or Uncharted 4 is a perfect example of a game that requires a crap ton of resources. Just think of the motion capturing alone required in a game like that. Not just facial animation, we're talking about just body motion animation and motion capture. It's ridiculously expensive to do that, and that's something that only AAA developers can really afford to do. So they have access to things that indie developers can't do, but indie developers do have access to what it is that AAA developers are trying to get into. And this is the reason why I don't think AAA developers are going to be able to make it, because multiplayer, they're going to be kicked out of multiplayer eventually. You're going to have smaller developers making better games than them for cheaper. PUBG is only $30. Star Wars Battlefront 2 was $60 at launch, and then you have all the DLC and microtransactions. PUBG has no microtransactions. Now we can look at another game like Warframe. Warframe doesn't cost anything at all. If you want to spend some money, you can, but you buy the exact items that you want or need, and you're not forced into buying just randomized packs. There's no RNG. And in all honesty, you don't actually have to buy anything, but you can grind it out. And some people prefer the grind, and those that don't can go ahead and get what they need when they need it for a few dollars. Also with Warframe, I was playing it over the past couple of months. Literally before I got to about 20, 30 hours in, I didn't even think of buying anything. In fact, I didn't have to really craft anything yet, because the basic stuff that the game gave you was more than enough to get you to that point. So think about that. Pretty much AAA developers, if they're looking at building more Destiny-type games like Anthem, which would be going up against things like Warframe. Now, I'm not saying Warframe's perfect, but Warframe is free, okay? I mean, it looks great, looks like a AAA game. It plays like a AAA game. The one area that it's kind of lacking is in its storytelling. Some people will argue with me on that, but in reality, it's not the most cohesive story-based experience, but it is a fantastic multiplayer experience. And that's where AAA developers are going to run into walls, because there are many, many other free-to-play or cheap-to-play, which that's what I would call PUBG. It's a complete game experience. There are no microtransactions. There's nothing else to buy. There's no other DLC. It's only $30 and you have everything. This is something that AAA developers just don't want to do. They're trying to get more money out of you, and they're trying to compete against these smaller developers that are giving you so much more for so much less, to the point where you can literally play the game as long as you want for free, and then if you choose to give them money, you can. Eventually, all AAA developers will return to story-based games. Sony and Nintendo continue to prove that story-based AAA games, that's where they belong. It's been successful for both of them, and this is the main reason why Sony people will say, hey, we have console exclusives over here compared to Microsoft, is because Sony is investing and developing very good, high-quality AAA games. Same thing with Nintendo. As I said before, AAA developers are the only ones financially able to produce games with professional writers, actors, CGI animators, the mocap, facial capture, and all of that really expensive high-end stuff to make games like Uncharted 4 or Horizon Zero Dawn. Now, mid-sized developers can get into that to a degree, but your smaller developers and your indie developers simply don't have access to that. Whereas indie developers can obviously go ahead and make excellent multiplayer games because they're simply just less. Cost to produce multiplayer games are significantly less because they don't have to pitch out money for all of that stuff that I just mentioned. So smaller indie developers can easily compete with AAA developers on that front. And with all the bad press that AAA developers have received recently from the microtransaction greed fest, consumers will be watching closely moving forward and setting the bar higher before purchasing their content. When a relatively small budget $30 game like PUBG sells more units than Star Wars Battlefront 2, with Disney licensing and everything, you know the gaming landscape has changed. Recommendations moving forward. For us as consumers, this is kind of a weird time. We're in flux. So buying games right away as they release is just kind of a bad idea, unless it's something that you know that you're going to enjoy, or it's from a publisher or developer that hasn't let you down yet. But in the meantime, look into smaller games before bothering with larger developers, especially if you prefer gameplay over story. And if you prefer story over gameplay, the best option is to go back and play retro games you may not have played before. You might be a big Final Fantasy fan and never played the original Final Fantasy on the NES. Why don't you go try that out? Maybe you really enjoy that. Final Fantasy 3 on the Super Nintendo. That was a fantastic game. That's my favorite in the entire series. Everybody likes to say 7. I like 3 better, which is 6 in Japanese. So depending on where you're looking, it's either 3 or 6. But regardless, there are tons of games out there that you may have not played before, especially if you're a new gamer, that are worth checking out. In the meantime, let the market kind of figure itself out. Let AAA developers figure out where they need to go, and let them start creating games that are actually worth your time and money. Either way, I recommend waiting 6 to 12 months after the release of any AAA game before you purchase them. The reason for this is you can go ahead and get the Game of the Year edition if it's a single-player game, and that's going to have all the DLC, and you can usually pick them up for $20 or $30 at that point. So you're getting a complete package versus maybe a game where the content's been stripped out so they can sell it back to you as DLC. So in this case, you're actually paying less money for the complete game just by waiting a few months. And in the interim, like I said, just go back and you can play some games that you haven't played before, or find something else, from a smaller developer that you haven't maybe never thought about playing. A good one would be Battle Chasers Night War. Like, that's on my list to be played. It looks really cool. It's made by a small developer, and it looks really, really fun, and it's typically only a few bucks on GOG. And let's face it, most multiplayer games will be dead after 6 to 12 months. Now, if a game actually survives past that, then you know it's worth it. So personally, what 2017 has taught me is really the value of patience. Between the skyrocketing prices and PC hardware to stay on top, DDR4 16 gig kit, so like $200 now. It's freaking crazy. There's really no reason to be that guy standing in line to be the first one to buy a game anymore. It's not like the old days where, if you didn't get it pretty much right away, you might never see it again, or you wouldn't see it for months on end. And it might be the best game ever. I remember GTA 3, it took me like 6 months to get a hands on a copy because it was so popular. You just couldn't find one. Same thing with Pokemon. It took me a long time to find one of those because it was so popular. Nowadays, you can just go online and download it. And typically, after 1 month, usually the game will be about 33% off. So usually it goes from $60 to $40. And then if you wait 6 to 9 months, usually the games are somewhere around $20 or $30. So by simply waiting, you can get the games for less money, and you will see what happens over time. Destiny 2 is the perfect example. Everybody gave the game great reviews. Even on this channel, even though I kind of saw what was coming, and I was probably early on that, Joe still was enjoying the game. He was still really into it, and it took him a few more weeks to kind of catch on and be where I was at and just figured out, man, this game sucks. The whole internet kind of figured that out as well. And then once the DLC dropped, everybody realized exactly what they were trying to do. With Destiny 2, Curse of Osiris, or whatever they called it, pretty much most of the content, the new gear that they put into it, is stuck behind the paywall. Yeah, there's some new stuff that you could do, new activities, but that was pretty boring and didn't really do anything and locked out vanilla players. And if you want the new stuff that the DLC was designed for, I guess, you know, the new gear, you had to pay extra money or grind like crazy to get those bright engrams. And it's a shame that, you know, the game itself got such great reviews at launch. So by waiting a little bit longer, like I said, even just 6 months, you'll have a fuller picture of the actual gameplay experience, especially these online games that take a really long time to get through. You can't beat Destiny in a day. You might be able to get to level 20, but you're not beating it. You might beat the campaign, but that's not beating it. Until you've beaten the raid 2 or 3 times. In these types of games, you have to finish the end game content and hit the maximum level, and then keep playing for a little while before you understand what the game's like. And because of that, you can't get day one reviews anyway that are accurate. So you might as well wait, save some money, and if the game's crap, you're going to save a lot of money because there's just no point in buying it. So that's what 2017 has taught me on that front. And then there's plenty of good stuff that have come out of 2017, and that's coming up in the next video. And there's a lot of good stuff moving forward and a lot of cool things that I'm seeing, especially for old school games, retro games, and just basically anything that was really, really great back in the day for us nostalgia, old gamers. And for you new gamers out there, you're going to get your chance to play great games, actually great games, for cheap. And you're not even going to need, you know, any extra hardware. And I'm going to go over that in the next video for you. But for now, that's all I've got. If you guys like this video, please hit that like button. Please comment. Please subscribe. That really helps me out. And I will catch you guys in the next video.